My name is Morteza Degani, and I would like to welcome you guys to the Camilleri Hall at the Brain and Creativity Institute. We're going to have our second speaker as part of the Big Data and Human Behavior speaker series. As I mentioned last time, the goal of the series is both to bring people like Tom, who are shakers and movers of the field, to USC to get to know their work better, but at the same time to bring people across USC who are interested in using machine learning and alternative methods for analyzing human behavior under the same roof. With the first talk, there were mostly psychologists in the room, and with this talk, we see mostly CS people in the room. Hopefully, except for one or two people, some in the back. But hopefully, we'll as the speaker series progresses, we'll get a mix of both engineers and social scientists. We have two speakers scheduled for the spring semester. We have Winter Mason from Facebook, and we have Olaf Sporns from University of Indiana, Bloomington. Before I introduce Tom, I would like to again thank Wendy Wood for helping with this series. And I would also like to thank Hannah and Antonio Damasio for allowing us to use this beautiful auditorium. We are delighted to have Tom Mitchell with us today. Tom really does not need an introduction. He's one of the fathers of machine learning. He was doing big data before big data was big data. I believe the second part, the human behavior part, is more recent, the past 15 years or so. Tom Mitchell founded and chairs the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon University, which I believe is the first machine learning department in the world. He is the E. Fredkin University professor. His research uses machine learning to develop computers that are learning to read the web, and uses brain imaging to study how the human brain understands what it reads. Mitchell is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a fellow and past president of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. Tom believes that the field of machine learning will be the fastest growing branch of computer science during the 21st century. Amen. Without further ado, join me in welcoming Tom Mitchell.
Well, thank you, Morteza, and great to see you all here. Some of you I actually recognize, we know each other, others not, but well, as the title suggests, what I want to talk about today is some work that we've been doing over a number of years, trying to understand what goes on up here when we read. And so this is work that includes quite a few collaborators. I'll just point out one of them, my primary collaborator, Marcel Just, a professor in our own psychology department at Carnegie Mellon, and also the head of our fMRI center. Marcel is the person who introduced me to brain imaging, and we've been working together now for ever since, so that's been fun. So the question that I'd like you to help me focus on for the next 45 minutes this is the research question we're interested in. How does the brain produce and represent language meaning when it's given language? And suppose you're interested in this question and you have access to some computers and some brain imaging methods, then what kind of a research strategy would you put together? Well, for us, here's the simplest way of describing the strategy. We've been running brain imaging experiments where we present people sometimes with words, sometimes with sentences, sometimes with stories, and trying to understand where is the neural activities, what's the spatial distribution of neural activity representing the meanings of those different language entities, and what's the temporal sequence of neural activity during that. And ultimately, of course, we're interested in the question of how the brain produces those things and what are the processes that the brain goes through to comprehend language. We're not all the way through this research agenda, and there's today more about the when and the where, we're starting to fill in that. We still are very far from understanding how the brain really implements language understanding. But this is a handy framework for me for thinking about what we're doing and what we're missing, and maybe it'll be helpful for parsing the talk. So many of you I know are already familiar with fMRI. We do experiments where we put people in an fMRI scanner. We show them stimuli. Often it would be, for example, a single word, or sometimes a picture instead, or sometimes a picture with a word. But somehow we give them stimuli that gets them to think about the meaning of something. And then we collect brain image data, which looks like this. Here's an fMRI image, actually 4 slices out of about 20 in the 3-dimensional volume of brain activity. And this particular brain image, here's the back of the brain, the front of the brain, was collected when a person looked at this stimulus here, a bottle. And so you can see blotchy neural activity. This is what we see when people look at this stimulus, at least this one person. So now one question you should ask immediately is, does it look any different if instead of bottle we show them computer? I don't have computer with me, but I can show you the average, the mean activity over 60 different words, and that looks like this. So you can see bottle kind of looks like your average word, but maybe there are a few differences here. And so, in fact, in most of the talk, I'll be, at least in the first part of the talk, discussing analyses we do on the difference. I could subtract out this mean activation from the activation for bottle. And if I do that, then I get this. And here you can see the differences that we obtain in the neural activity when somebody thinks about bottle as opposed to your average word. So that's what the data looks like. And now the brain teaser becomes, what do we would do with this data if we want to develop some kind of systematic understanding of neural representations. So the first thing we thought of, kind of obvious, is to try to simply train a computer program to classify brain images according to what the stimulus is. So for example, we might train our system by providing it a set of training examples. Here's a brain image, and this time the person's thinking about the word bottle. Here's another brain image where, again, they're thinking about bottle. Here's the third one where they're thinking about hammer. And given that set of training data, supervised labeled brain images, we could train a classifier to try to then classify additional subsequent brain images. And then we could measure how well it does on those new brain images that were not part of the training set. And if it could classify them better than chance, then we know that it's capturing something about a systematic spatial distribution of neural activity. So we did that, and as many people here, in fact, have done as well, and we found that it worked. Okay, so this is in fact showing us the classification accuracy for each of several different participants in an fMRI study, where we presented words that were either tools like hammers, chisel, pliers, or buildings like palace, house, apartment. And the classification accuracy for, after training, then given a new brain image, the classification accuracy for predicting whether the stimulus was a tool word or a building word for participant number 4 is very high. And you see, in fact, for everybody in the study, it was far above the 0.5 chance that we'd expect if it was just guessing. Okay, so this is good. This means that, mainly what this means is that there is enough resolution, spatial resolution, in fMRI. The resolution, by the way, is on the order of a millimeter. There is enough resolution to detect the fine nuance, the differences. I'll avoid saying fine nuances. The differences in brain activity when people think about hammer or house. Okay, so now, but the real significance here is that, in retrospect, the real significance of this is that we've got ourselves now a tool. And I think of two revolutions, from my point of view, that have happened in neuroscience in the last 15 or so years. The first one was the advent of good brain imaging methods like fMRI. That let us see for the first time what is the neural activity going on in there. The second revolution, I think, maybe, is that we can now see not only where is the activity, but what's the information content. And that's what these classifiers are. When we train a classifier, we're designing ourselves a virtual sensor of the information content in the neural activity of the brain. So instead of just saying, oh, it looks like there's activity here, we can now say, well, there's actually activity here that's encoding the semantic distinction between hammers and houses. And once you get that idea, then you can think of a lot of ways of using it. So for example, we could just look at one part of the brain. What if we only trained our classifier on the little cubic centimeter of brain tissue right here and saw whether in that location the neural activity encoded the semantic distinction between hammer and house? Or what if we moved it over here? We could actually build a little 1 cubic centimeter Rubik's Cube kind of thing and move it around and train it and test it in each location and build a map of where in the brain that information content is. And if you do that, in fact, in this case, here's what that map looks like. So here you see we tried this training and testing the classifier on 27 voxels, which is literally about a cubic centimeter of brain tissue. And what you see here in red and green are the regions of the brain where the neural activity actually does successfully classify. And what's kind of interesting about this particular picture is if you look at this, this region, for example, is part of premotor cortex. That's the part of your brain that's active if you're thinking about doing this. Of course, in the scanner, nobody's allowed to move, so nobody's thinking about doing this, hopefully. But they are thinking about the word hammer, and it turns out that's enough to excite neural activity in premotor cortex. This region, in contrast, over here, is part of the parahippocampal gyrus, which, from other studies, we know is associated with thinking about your spatial relationship to the environment around you. And it turns out words like house and apartment excite neural activity in parahippocampal gyrus. So here you see kind of one of the possible uses of this classifier, AKA, also known as virtual sensor of information content. We can scan it around the brain and see where different types of information is encoded. We can also use this to ask interesting questions like, are the neural representations the same in your brain and mine? So we could train a classifier on all the people on this side of the room and then ask whether it could successfully decode the thoughts of people on this side of the room. And if the answer was yes, then we know there must be some similarity between the neural codes, people over here and over here. So we tried this. Effectively, what we did here is we turned an interesting neuroscience question into the equivalent machine learning question. And the answer is yes. In fact, here you see in black, just like before, the accuracy that we get if we train and test on a single individual. What you see in white is the accuracy that we get for participant 1 if we do not train on any data from participant 1, but instead use all the data from all the other subjects. And what you see in general is that the white bars are about, on average, about as high as the black bars. So what that means, inescapably, is that there's some very strong consistency from one person to another in terms of the spatial distribution of neural activity that encodes the difference between meanings of these concrete nouns. This was an experiment run on 60 concrete nouns. Okay, so once you get that idea, you realize you could ask a lot of questions, not just are these neural codes the same in your brain and mine, but we could ask, well, what if we show you a word versus a picture? Do we get the same neural code? What if we show it to you in Portuguese, and what if we show it to you in English? And so we've done some of those studies, and we found that the neural representations, in fact, are similar across language, English, Portuguese, across individuals, and across modality, stimulus modality, a word versus a picture. We also found, branching out from concrete nouns, that some other words, for example, emotion words, are very stably encoded, very easy to train a classifier to reliably decode, including across people. On the other hand, we found that abstract words like justice and democracy are not. In fact, it's difficult even to get within a single participant reliable classification accuracy for those. It's not a joke, it's just a reality, sorry. Verbs are also a problem. In fact, this is one of the first things we tried. Once we realized it worked for nouns, we thought, oh, we'll just now we'll do verbs. It didn't work at all. We give verbs like cut and heal, and we got chance level classification accuracy when we tried that. On the other hand, we found later that if we gave, instead of cut and heal, if we gave the phrase surgeons cut and surgeons heal, then we had very good classification accuracy. So there's something different about verbs that the phenomena is simply that once you ground that verb with in this case, the agent doing the verb, that's enough to generate a stable neural activity. It could also have to do with polysemy. Cut is a very strange, or a very multi-meaning word, polysemic word, right? So you could cut into line. You could cut like a surgeon cuts. There are lots of different meanings. But anyway, these are some of the things you see. So from there, you can see that we could actually train classifiers on a number of words and start to build up a catalog of the patterns of neural activity associated with each word. But, and it's kind of a step forward, but it's not a very satisfying endpoint, because if you really want to have a theory of neural representations of meaning, then theories are logical systems that make predictions that go beyond the data that you've already seen. And we want an understanding of neural representations of meaning that is generative, that's able to make predictions about neural activities for stimuli that we have not trained the system on. So we got interested in this question. Basically, we'd like a system like this. And so the first version of the system that worked for doing this was a system that made a prediction. You could give it any concrete noun you like, and it would predict neural activity in a two-step process. The first step is actually to look up that noun that you give it in 1 trillion words of text and represent in computer-readable form an approximation to the word meaning by a vector of corpus statistics about the word. And the first version of this we used were just a set of 25 verbs like run, touch, taste, rub, manipulate, sensory motor verbs, hear, see, and so forth, and just the frequency that those verbs occurred with, in this case, telephone. And then in the second step, it would take that vector, computer understandable approximation of the word meaning, as the basis for predicting the neural activity at each of 20,000 locations in the brain, which is the number of pixels, voxels, in a fMRI image. So when we did that, let's take that in a little bit more detail. Here, for example, is what we see for celery. if in that first step, when the system looks up celery in the corpus, it finds that it occurs a lot with the verb eat and not very much with ride. Whereas airplane occurs a lot with ride and not very much with rub and manipulate. So you can see this kind of matches your intuitive feel of reasonable capturing of some of the semantics of the word. And then in step 2, the model used this vector representation of the word to predict the neural activity in each voxel in the brain. So for example, to be precise, it predicts the activity in voxel V, say this place right here, is just the sum over those 25 verbs, like eat and taste and so forth, of the frequency with which verb I occurs with the stimulus word W. If the stimulus is celery, for example, our corpus statistics tell us that the frequency for that for celery is 0.84, times some coefficient which must be trained, must be learned during training. And that coefficient, actually here's a map of those learned coefficient values for the verb eat. That's a coefficient that tells us how much the ith verb generates activity in the vth voxel. And since there are 20,000 voxels in the brain, and we have a separate coefficient here for each voxel and for each verb, that gives us about 500,000 learned parameters in the model. But you see what's going on. It's a regression problem. So we train the system then by saying, here's a noun, telephone. Here's a brain image when somebody thinks about telephone. And from that, the system looks up the verb co-occurrences and then trains a model that uses those verb co-occurrences. In fact, we never have experimental data where we showed people these verbs. We just showed them the nouns. Okay. So here's a model, and you can ask, does it work? Well, one way is I can show you that if we trained on words not including celery and airplane, then here's the predicted activity as opposed to, unbeknownst to the program, the actual observed fMRI images for those two words. And so you can see it's capturing some, but not all of the structural, of the neural activity in the actual observed thing. But it is capturing quite a bit of it. We can also be more quantitative. We can ask, well, how does it work quantitatively? We could measure, for example, in fact, what we did, we had 60 nouns. We would train it on only 58 of those nouns. The other two, which it hadn't seen, we would then give to it like this. We'd have it predict them, and we would then show it these two images, but we would not tell it which one was celery and which was airplane. It would have to tell us. And so if the model was just making random guesses, then by chance it would get 50% of those guesses correct. And if it was better than 50% significantly, then we would think there was content in it. So when we did that, in fact, the model is 79% of the time, when it looks at two words it had not seen, it's able to predict their fMRI data well enough to tell us which of these two observed images is which word. Okay, so that's kind of where this took us. Now think about what this means in terms of the coding of meaning of at least concrete nouns in your brain. One thing it means is that those codes for different words, they're not a random hash code where each word just happens to get a different hash code. They're systematically assembled out of semantic primitives. In fact, what this model is doing, literally, is predicting the fMRI image for any concrete noun that you can think of that appears in 1 trillion words of text as a weighted linear sum of 25 different coefficient sets that it learned for those 25 different verbs. So, and the fact that this is able to get, not all the time, but a substantial amount of the time, the right answer on which image matches a new pair of words, means that there's real content in this model. So it means, number one, that no, they're not hash codes. There's a more primitive semantic level underlying the neural representations that we see for individual words. Second, it means that if you want to know what those semantic primitives are, and this is a slippery problem to think about, at least I can make the following statement. It suffices, at least to get this level of accuracy, to look up the words on the web and count those 25 corpus statistics. And if you think about it, the web is just a ton of behavioral data collected over many, many, many different people in many different occasions. And the fact that they mentioned the verb eat a lot with celery and the verb ride a lot with airplane is really just an aggregate behavioral data that in aggregate really does reflect semantics in ways that people think about things. That's why they speak about things in those words. And so maybe there's a fit. John.
I don't know if you want questions now, but so here you predefine what those features meant. So the newer kind of work where you're learning distributed vectors where you don't predefine meaning of the individual elements. I don't know whether you've tried it or have any intuitions whether that would work better or worse than an approach like this.
Yeah, okay, so I was waiting to hear your question to decide whether I wanted to answer. I like the question, so I do want to answer that, but give me a slide to answer it. So John's absolutely right, as usual. It's ludicrous to think that these 25 verbs, which, by the way, I just made up, motivated by the idea that a lot of people were starting to see that neural activity encoding different concrete nouns was often grounded in sensory motor regions. Therefore, I made up 25 verbs that had a lot to do with sensory motor actions, like see, touch, taste, smell, rub, manipulate, eat. But I just made them up. And so it can't be that I was lucky and I got the right ones. So we did go on an effort to try alternatives, and we found that it was hard to get better than this, but we did eventually do better by replacing our original 25 verbs, and the count there was whether that verb occurred as a token within 5 words of the noun. And now, in fact, the features that we use these days, because it works better, are features where we take an object, a noun, and each feature in the vector is now a dependency role and the word at the other edge of the dependency of the word. So for example, we take a noun like book, and we find within our web text that he wrote a book is a context for a book, then the dependency parse of this tells us that there's a determiner called A, which is linked to book, and that'll become a feature, and that book is a direct object of the verb wrote, and so that will become a feature, and so forth. So this is a more refined version of that. It's a much higher dimensional one, because we have about 100 million dependency features that we use. But then we run principal components analysis, a dimensionality reduction method, to shrink that down, usually to about 1,000 features that are a summary of those 100 million, and that's what we're using these days. I still don't defend this as the answer to the question of what is the semantic basis for the brain, and that I still consider an open question, although we have a few clues that I will get to over time.
PCA, can you tell which kind of words clustered with most significant dimensions? I still these kind of sensory motor words at the end of the day, like the first dimensions.
Yeah, so PCA helps, but here's the problem. So if you think about it, what this model is doing is it's saying every brain image you can think of as a point in a 25-dimensional space. The 25 dimensions are those 25 verbs, right? Well, suppose there are only 3, so we can talk about it this way. Suppose I only have 3 verbs. Basically, our model is saying any image can be described as a weighted linear combination of 3 vectors, 3 sort of eigenimage kind of things. It's actually saying it for 25. But now if you ask me the question, what's the basis set that the brain is actually using? You have to realize that my model is going to work just as well. Suppose secretly the brain is using this basis set, these 3 semantic primitives. And therefore, we can get weighted linear combinations of these in our trained model that predict well any of these brain images that we have. Well, a little simple linear algebra shows you that any rotation of that axis, of that basis, will work equally well, because all the basis has to do really is span the space of the brain image points that we're trying to explain. So it's kind of an underdetermined question if you just ask it simply as, what's the basis set that gives me the greatest accuracy? In fact, not only every rotation, but also every squeezing and expanding of these, as long as I don't actually make them collinear, which it would be very unlikely. So just about any 3 random vectors that I choose in this space is sufficient to span the 3D space, and similarly the 25D space. So to ask what is the semantic basis the brain is really using requires a more refined question than simply what set of vectors work best. We did pick random words, and they don't work as well as my 25, so it kind of defeats my argument. But all right. So, in fact, in the original paper, we plotted how well these 25 verbs work versus 1,000 other randomly generated sets, and it was like by far the winner. So there is something real about the sensory motor aspect of those verbs. And I think actually the random sets we were choosing did not happen to span that same semantic space that these 25 did. Okay, we also looked at feature sets that were behaviorally obtained. For example, what if instead of corpus statistics, we just describe words by behavioral data that we could get from Mechanical Turk, and Dean Pomerleau made up a set of 1,000 questions, 218 questions, like is it heavy, is it flat, is it colorful, can it break, can it swim, can it change shape? And we had people on Mechanical Turk give us the answer to those, and those work pretty well too. Okay, but the best set that we've learned, that we've gotten so far, is actually obtained by turning this into a machine learning question. So we could say, well, we've got data, let's have the program figure it out. And so Indra Rastandi, one of our PhD students, in his thesis work, did the following thing. First, he took data collected from 20 different sessions. Some of these were when the 60 words were presented as word and picture pairs. Others, they were words only. And he learned a model that looks like this. And the key thing is, here we input a word. It first encodes that word with those 218 Mechanical Turk features. Then it projects that into a 20-dimensional latent space, which is learned. And from that latent space, it then can predict for each of these 20 different subjects, human subjects, their fMRI images using the same shared population-wide semantic basis. And this one gives us our best answer. And I won't go into the details of the machine learning method, but basically it involves a 3-step process where you first learn this latent representation using a technique called canonical correlation analysis, and then train a regression to predict those 20 components from the observed Mechanical Turk features. But the reason the thing I like best about this slide, the most important lesson of this slide, is this is an indicator of the direction that we need to go in the future. What's nice about this model, in contrast to the first one, is that here we have a model that covers different subjects, different human subjects simultaneously. In fact, uses the data from different human subjects in a slightly different experiments. And it learns a generative predictive model that goes beyond the training data, where the learned parameters, some of those learned parameters are person independent. This semantic representation of words is just learned across all people. And then over here, there are person individual specific parameters that are also being learned. And I think this kind of model, well, it outperformed our other ones, which were trained only on single subjects. But the importance of this is this lets us start to look into the question of what's common across us all, and then what are the individual variations. There are other ways you might decide to split up the parameters between individual, specific, and group, but this model is at least moving in the doing that in some ways. It also is getting at another problem that we have generically, which is that we're fundamentally data starved if we're trying to understand something as complex as this. And from any single experiment and any single person, we'll never have enough data to estimate the many, many parameters that we're going to need to model something this complex. We were talking about this earlier this morning, and so this is at least a step in the direction of a machine learning approach that simultaneously looks at 20 different subjects, 10 of whom were doing this experimental protocol and 10 of which were doing this, and simultaneously uses all that data to learn both population-wide and individual-specific parameters. And there's a lot further we need to go in that direction, but I can't help thinking that's inevitably the direction we're going to be forced into if we're going to try to take advantage of this growing volume of diverse experimental data that's out there. How we doing? Okay, so by the way, Morteza, let me ask, when did we start or when do I end?
You have all the time. We started at 2:07.
Okay, good. So we're good. All right, so let's stop for a moment and look at what we've seen. So far what we've been looking at is the spatial distribution of neural activity that codes meaning. But of course, meaning we live in time. And so it's interesting to ask, what's the temporal dynamics of this? And I was showing you that fMRI image that we got when somebody looked at the stimulus bottle. But that image is captured once per second in this particular study. And some of you probably know how long it takes a person to understand a word. Most people who study it say it takes 400 milliseconds for you to understand a word. Most people read 3 words a second when you read the morning newspaper. So we are getting this every 1 second image, kind of is averaging neural activity over time. What does the real time look like? So we started several years ago looking at a second brain imaging technique, magnetoencephalography, or MEG, and this gives us 1 millisecond time resolution. Gives us a different image every millisecond. So I'm going to show you a movie of what really happens in your brain when you read a word. In this case, it's just a person looking at the word hand. The word hand appears on the screen at time 0. Here we're at time -20, but let me play the movie and see what this really looks like. I'll read out the time so you can keep looking at the neural activity. Okay, so we're at -20, here we go. What? How can this be happening? Let me try something. That's very strange. Let me just quit. It's worth seeing this movie if we can do it. I don't think there's a resolution issue here, is there? Let's just reboot the whole thing. Well, you know what I'm going to do before we do this? I just want to kill off all active apps. I have nothing against Microsoft, but let's kill one. Okay, here we go. Oh, no. Sorry. Okay, let's come in at it this way. Okay, let's try that again. Hopefully this will do it. Yes, okay. We're at 70 milliseconds, 100, 200, 300, 400 milliseconds. You just understood the word. Okay, so there's a ridiculous amount of dynamics going on in your brain during that 400 milliseconds that you're reading the word. With MEG, we can now do in time what we did at the beginning of the talk in space. Remember when we trained this little 1 cubic centimeter spotlight classifier to see where in the brain was information encoded? We can now do that not just in space, but in space-time. And so we can, in fact, this is what Gus Sudre, one of our recent PhD students, did. He trained over 1 million classifiers. He took the 218 mechanical Turk features, like is it bigger than a bread box and so forth. For each of those 218 features, he tried training a predictor of the value of that feature for the stimulus word. And he tried it at different 50 millisecond time windows and in 70 some different anatomically defined regions of the brain. And then he would train on a subset of the data and of course test it on a held out set of data to see whether it was successful in learning to make these predictions. And what he found was the vast majority of these trained classifiers were operating at chance level. They were not successfully decoding that particular feature of the word at that particular time in that particular brain location. But some of them were. And so then, instead of a movie of this brain activity, he produced the following kind of movie. At 50 milliseconds, 0 to 50 milliseconds, none of those features are decodable. At 50 to 100, we start to get perceptual features like word length, how many letters are in the word, but nothing semantic. At 150, similar. 150 to 200, we get our first semantic feature. Is it hairy? and on. Okay, so again, he's able, because of using these kind of trained classifiers as virtual sensors of information content, he's able to turn that movie of brain activity into a movie of information flow, data flow in the brain during that 400 milliseconds of word comprehension. So it's fun to look at this kind of movie, but it's kind of hard to get your head around. To see what he really discovered from that, let me show you a different way of looking at the data. What I can do is I could take one of those features. We'll start with word length, the number of letters in the word. And I could draw you a plot where on this axis we have time, and along this axis we have different brain regions. And then I'll just color code at each time in each brain location, how accurately can we decode the number of letters in the word. And if it's high, I'll make it red, and if it's chance, I'll make it blue. Okay? So now think for a minute what you think that picture is going to look like. One hypothesis is that your brain looks at the word for a while, and then suddenly this part of the brain can decode the word length, and then a little bit later this one, and a little bit later this one. There's a question like, how long does that encoding persist? Is it from now until 600 milliseconds later? Or is it a flash in the pan and then it's moving over here? There are a lot of questions about how this could look. Here's what it looks like. Interesting. So what you see is basically up until 100 to 150 milliseconds, there's no decodability. Then there is. But once it's decodable, it's simultaneously decodable at each of half a dozen different locations in the brain. Here are their names. And then it persists for, about 100 or 150 milliseconds, and then it's gone. By the time that we get to 400 milliseconds, when you understand the word, there's no place in your brain from which we can use the neural activity to decode how many letters were in the brain, were in that word.
Does this depend on whether it is shown as a picture or in written form? This is true both ways. This is only a feature of word length. Oh, I see. You mean if we show you a picture of a hammer? Yeah.
No. This is all text. This is text. So this is the low-level percept. Now let's look at, what about semantic features? So let's look at animacy. This actually turns out to be the earliest feature that we see coded. The earliest semantic feature. Well, now it's not at 100 to 150 milliseconds. This is a little later, 150 to 200 milliseconds. But again, once you can decode it, it's decodable simultaneously at several regions in the brain. And there aren't too many places where it moves around too after that. It's kind of, there are a few. And once it appears, it persists for hundreds of milliseconds. It's not like those perceptual features. And at 400 milliseconds, the time when you nominally understand the word, it's encoded at all the places that could ever encode it, including my new favorite place in the brain, the left supramarginal gyrus, which is sort of at the juncture of the left temporal lobe and parietal lobe. That's my new favorite place in the brain because for many of these features, at exactly 400 milliseconds, you can suddenly decode that semantic feature at that location. Interesting. And these are different places. So anyway, you get the idea. Grasping is another feature. This one's a little later, 200 to 300 milliseconds. Size is another one. So from this, we're able to start to get a little picture of the data flow sequence in the brain. These colored bars are actually the row from those diagrams we were just looking at, showing different brain regions that encode the feature, and the vertical axis here is showing when those features first appear. So the emerging picture is that it's not the case that your brain stares at the word and stares at it and then figures out what the word is and indexes into semantic meaning, and suddenly your whole brain gets simultaneously that semantic meaning. That's not what we see. Instead, what we see is that features trickle in. First, things that have nothing to do with semantics, but just perceptual operation, the words, the letters in the word. But then a cascade over time of semantic features, with the earliest one being, is it alive? Interesting. In studies of visual processing, people have also found that if you put a picture up and give it to somebody and there's a tiger over here, you'll do a saccade to that tiger before 100 milliseconds. That's one of these things that just appears to be hardwired into you. And so it's very interesting that also in these studies, which were not with photographs, that animacy is an early feature. So we still don't know what's going on or how it's using this, but we're at least beginning to get a kind of data flow picture of information during word comprehension. Yeah?
Yeah, can you say again what the instructions for the subjects were? So you're showing them text, and then what do they do with the text?
We've run this a couple different ways. I think the data we're looking at here, the
the instructions to the people we were actually giving them a question. The question was something like, is it bigger than a bread box? We had 20 different questions. We'd give them a question, we'd show them the 60 words, and they had to press a button to answer it. We also ran a version where the instructions were just think about it. And in fact, what we found was that you can modulate the timing of these feature onsets by the question. So in general, these features speed up by on the order of 100 milliseconds when you go from just think about it to here's a question you should be answering. And it seems to speed up all of the features, though, not just the one that you're trying to answer. Or at least we didn't see a selectivity of the one that you're trying to answer.
You didn't see modulation based on the question at different speeds?
We didn't, but I'm not sure we had enough statistical power to see it if it was there. So I wouldn't rule it out, but we did not see it. Okay, good. So, so then let me wrap up with a newer study that we're doing. So this is all about words. What about sentences and stories? So let me skip over this. I want to tell you briefly about some newer work, which is not yet published. But we've been doing now experiments presenting, again with MEG, the 1 millisecond time resolution data, stimuli like this. The student found a door. We present the word on the screen for 300 milliseconds, followed by 200 milliseconds of blank space. And then with every half second, a new word replaces the old. And we made up some sentences, half of which were active, like the student found a door, and half of which were in passive voice. The door was found by the student. And we just collected the data. Here's what the MEG data looks like. I'll show you a picture where the vertical axis is different sensors. The MEG scanner has 306 sensors around the periphery of the head. So that'll be our vertical axis. Time will be horizontal, and the color is just literally the magnitude of the MEG activity. So here it is. So the onset of the first word is here. A, student, found the hammer. And this is the MEG activity. So it's kind of interesting that you could just look at this movie. This is a movie, right? Each point in time is an entire 306 set of MEG helmet readings. You could look at this movie and you could tell me where the words were on. You know, there's a word around here, another one around here, another one around here. You can see it in the MEG activity. What's interesting is if I count them off, a student found the hammer, there's this other stuff after the sentence, including a whole bunch of neural activity post-sentence processing. It's very systematic. We see it all the time, every subject. We didn't know this till we did this. Now, what if we try Gus's idea of training classifiers across time? We'll use 200 millisecond wide window now, and we'll in fact use it to decode sentence structure. Let's see if we can decode the agent of the sentence, the verb, and the patient. And this, by the way, is work that's been done with a number of people. Nicole Rafidi is the key graduate student here. So we'll just train a linear mapping from the MEG activity, 200 millisecond window, to those semantic dependency features that I was mentioning. In fact, the 1,000-dimensional PC8 version of them. And then notice this lets us do every part of speech, because every part of speech, not just nouns, has a collection of dependency features. So now, what do you expect to see for agents? Well, there are a couple theories you could imagine about how you process sentences. For example, is it all incremental? If yes, then we should see that you think about the agent of the sentence maybe once. Or you might say, no, agents are neurally encoded at multiple times. So here's what we find. In fact, we have the active voice sentences, then the agent is student. Student found the door. It's decodable in the purple coded regions. Very interesting. So it's decodable when the agent is actually on the screen and you're reading it. That's good. But it's also decodable over here, including after the sentence is done. What about the passive voice? Again, student is the agent. We only decode it here. And notice, these sentences are of different length. So the post-sentence activity after passive sentences does not seem to have the same kind of decodability that we see for active sentences. What about the patient? So again, the patient is the other word, right? Student found a door. Oh, there's the decodability of the door. It extends far beyond the end of the sentence. Or in the passive voice, the door was found by the student. Interesting, see? It's decodable here, and then not here, and then suddenly by. So if you're reading a sentence, the most common thing is that if I say determiner noun, most frequently that'll be the agent. Most sentences are active, not passive. So if I say the door, your default assumption should be that door is going to be the agent. The door closed. The door blue closed. And so passive is the kind of unusual case. So I would say here, one possibility is here you're assuming door is going to be agent. Now you find was found, so now it's no longer the agent. When you see the word by, you know the next thing that's coming is the agent. The door was found by. Next thing's got to be the agent, syntactically. And suddenly you bring back into the fore your encoding, the neural encoding of patient. So that's just the evidence. Why you're doing that or what it means about processing, you could speculate. One thing you could speculate is, of course, you're trying to assemble this proposition, found student door, and you're pulling up these neural encodings of the patient again because you're about to do a rebinding of verb roles, maybe. I'm not sure, but anyway, there's the empirical evidence. What about the verbs? So what do we see for verbs? Here's what we see. So the student found is a verb, and then again we see it at the end. And also in the passive sentences we see it during and again at the end, with a little bit more delay for the passive. And I'm not sure how, we want to see this in more data before I attach any significance to this. It could be that you're just kind of thinking in some not very synchronous way about the meaning of the sentence, and we happen to see it there. I'm not sure. Okay, but so here's kind of the summary, at least for the active sentences. So for active sentences, here's where we see the agent, the verb, and the patient. And the remarkable thing is, over here, after the sentence is gone, there's a time in which all three of these things are actually decodable from the neural activity. And so one hypothesis, of course, is this is the post-sentence wrap-up thinking that you're doing to assemble the neural code for the proposition itself. Reading sentences is not about thinking once about words and forgetting them. It's about getting the meaning of the sentence. And so maybe here what we're seeing is actually evidence of the neural code for the proposition. One thing that I would love to see, but we don't have yet, is the argument binding, right? If the argument binding is obvious if a student find a door because the door could not find the student. That's not something you're going to be thinking. But if Mary kicked Joe or Joe kicked Mary, there's got to be a way in the brain that you're keeping track of which of those arguments is filling which of those roles. And so I think there's a very interesting question to be asked, and Nicole and others are looking currently at that. Okay, so let me wrap up by just giving you a pointer to an upcoming talk. Here, on December 15th, by another one of our students, Layla Webby, who is, for her thesis, doing story reading, scanning people with both fMRI and MEG while they're reading Harry Potter stories. She's also collaborating with Kevin and Ashish, who are here. And so she'll be here and she can talk about some of that work while she is. So then just to summarize, what have we seen and what does it all mean? I think what we've seen from a neuroscience point of view is pretty compelling evidence that there is a systematic code for meanings of concrete nouns and other words in the brain that we're starting to get a handle on. We still don't fully understand it, but at least we have a generative model now that can make semi-accurate predictions for arbitrary nouns of the neural activity observed when people think about those nouns. We're starting to get a picture of the detailed timing of the data flow of information in the brain during that 400 milliseconds that it takes you to comprehend a word. And with the same kind of techniques, we can now start to look at more aggregate language phenomena than individual words. We can start to look at sentences and use these techniques to try to study the composition of the semantics of the full sentence from the sequence of words that's being understood. And here we saw in this recent stuff by Nicole how that looks for sentences, and when Layla comes in a few weeks, she'll be talking about more long-term structure, narrative structure of stories as well. So there's, to me, in one sentence, the summary of the talk is machine learning is a very useful tool for studying neural representations of meaning. They're very intriguing, very basic questions that are not even yet answered, which are accessible by this. And so this is actually a great time to be entering the field because there's, I think, a long run of very interesting results to be obtained. So thanks.
So this is going to actually be at ISI, not here. Other than that, we have 10 minutes for questions.
So it's really beautiful talk. I wonder if we still have some blind spot here. That is, so it seems like the regions that are good for decoding of information are those regions like, you know, where representation is relatively sparse. So like, you know, the artificial cortices, the model cortices, places like this. So the question is whether what we're looking at is the projections of the actual cognitive processing that is going on, or the cognitive processing itself.
Yeah. So I like that question because there's a difference between the following two statements. It's possible to decode which verb the person is reading here in the brain at this time. That's statement one. Statement two is the brain is using this neural activity to encode the meaning of the verb in this place and this time. So the fact that you can decode something doesn't mean that's what the brain is using the neural activity for. So for example, I could find and have found that I can tell whether, or our program can tell once it's trained, whether better than chance what the part of speech is during the first 150 milliseconds after we put a word on the screen in occipital cortex in early visual regions. But the fact that the program can decode that, all it really means is that there's some information there encoded in that neural activity that correlates with parts of speech. And it turns out the parts of speech correlate with, for example, the number of characters in the word. So adjectives are longer than determiners. And so the fact that I could decode parts of speech there doesn't resolve the question of whether the brain is using that to code part of speech or some other correlated feature like number of letters in the word. And so that's actually the big, methodologically, that's the key, I think, the key issue that we are up against. And how do you deal with that? We've, in some cases, especially when we have people look at very diverse stimuli like stories, we can actually pull out the data that, for example, we could pull out all words of length 5 and see if we can still decode part of speech in that region. So we can actually condition on the possible confound if we have enough diversity in the stimuli. But anyway, I don't want to get too carried away, but your point is a good one, and methodologically there's something very fundamental here that needs to be recognized and still solved in some sense.
So people who spend a lot of time worrying about what semantics is actually like tend to react negatively when you say, oh, well, you can use an LSA type approach, or you can, oh, you just correlated features, right? And both of those work really well for the purposes of decoding brain activity, but I wonder if you think there's a way to use these approaches to get at the question of like, well, if neither of those things could really be what semantics actually is, what is it, right? So, I mean, are the approaches always going to be dependent on capturing something that, or are they always going to work well if you get a good estimate of similarity space, or do you think if you could actually use it to answer questions about how semantics is actually organized?
Give me an example of an answer to how semantics is organized.
Yeah, well, right. So, I mean, those are the kinds of questions that people don't know how to answer outside. Oh, well, so there are people who develop formal semantic systems that will tell you all sorts of interesting things about how semantics must be organized given the patterns you observe in the language. There are also people who study the development of
Right, okay, so let's take a concrete example. I like your question. So some people think that there's, in fact, most people seem to think that there's a Eleanor Roche style level of sort of basic level of abstraction that we hit. So if I ask you, what's this, you're likely to say a dog, not a chihuahua, and not an animal. There's a kind of level of abstraction. So is that an example of the kind of thing you're talking about, how semantic really works?
Well, so the alternative, there are other alternatives. So there's like causal models of semantics. So the fact that certain things some things are correlated accidentally, other things are correlated because they're causally related. And if you're only using correlational approaches to understanding what semantics is like, then you can't discriminate those things. So a classic example being like 3 or 4-year-olds will tell you that a statue can't walk even though it has legs. But an Angora rabbit, where the legs are invisible, they know it can walk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a correlational approach that is learned has legs is correlated with can walk, has no way of pulling those things apart without a ton of other vectors, right?
I'm with you.
You're left saying what I know about celery is that it co-occurs with eat, not that,
I see what you're getting. Yeah. So this is great. There's a big difference, I think, part of what you're pointing to, between the question of how do you represent what neural activity represents a word, and what knowledge do you have about that entity? Those are two different questions in my mind. They're not completely unrelated, because how I represent tomato is partly due to the fact that I know they taste good, or however they taste, because we do see gustatory cortex as part of what, and Also, part of how I represent tomato is based on my knowledge that I grasp it like this, because we do see motor cortex activity when we get tomato. But there are a lot of other things I know about tomatoes. They grow on plants, they take a lot of months to ripen. Usually the frost comes before all mine are ripe. All kinds of things I know that are not part of my 400 millisecond representation of the word tomato. And instead, there's this inference process that I can evoke, but I usually don't when I'm reading about tomatoes, that lets me draw these other conclusions. So there's this kind of interesting blur between what it means to look at the neural activity that represents an item versus the knowledge that one actually has about that item. And I think we're maybe just entering the phase where it's sensible to start looking at that distinction. Up until now, when we just show individual words, we're kind of getting the instantaneous, what you just kind of automatically think about during the 400 milliseconds. But except in the case where we ask those questions, like, is it bigger than a bread box? But when you're reading a sentence, I say, I ate the spaghetti with a fork, or I ate the spaghetti with a meatball. You're actually asking, in order to resolve, was the fork part of the spaghetti? Was the meatball in the spaghetti? You're actually asking yourself a question about meatballs and about forks that you might not ask in every sentence. So I think once we start looking at these words in context, we get an opportunity to look at the neural phenomena surrounding inferences that I think we can assume are being made in the brain, and seeing if we can pull those out. So that's a really interesting and fundamental direction for future research.
This is fascinating. I just have you look into bigger sentences and maybe several sentences? Have you looked to look at co-reference? So can I say?
At what?
Co-reference. Like Tom gave a talk, then he went out for dinner.
That's
Can
great.
you get Tom and he to light up? Kind of
Yeah. It's so great you said that. We haven't done that. We have an experiment on the drawing board where we're going to collect more active passive sentences because we're interested in getting more diversity. And we decided this time we're going to ask people a question afterwards, and it's going to involve he, she, or it. And originally we were just thinking the question is a way of making sure people were attending to the semantic content of the sentence. But then we realized we might as well use we might as well use things that force co-reference, so we can observe while they're answering the question or reading the question, what's the neural activity associated with it, and how does that evolve?
Wondering whether you have evidence that people are using their brains in a similar way that you're doing. So when you're saying, if you ask the question, so the things where the information disappears after a while, like the length of the word, if you ask people, how long is this word, does that reactivate? Does that come back when they're thinking of the answer, or is it something else that's recalculating that? Or have you done
Wow, we haven't done that behavioral test. What would you ask them specifically?
So, I mean, some of the same questions that you're finding, you have high correlation between word length at a certain time period, and then it goes away. So if you ask them, you show the word for a while, then you say how long is the word after it disappears, and when they think about the word length, are they activating those same areas again, or is that something completely different?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, that would be interesting. We haven't tried that. I think, our ability to introspect on these things that happen at sub-second levels is just horrible. We can't really introspect very much at all on that. But we have ways, you're suggesting ways of evoking that stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.